welcome back to the review. This is part number 2. Chris and Ben still join me. We ended part 1 by talking about that win over Middlesbrough, the 1-0 win that felt like quite a big moment in terms of Norwich's season. They then follow this with 3 wins on the bounce: Reading, QPR, Wigan. It was a sign of progress that they were beginning to lay the foundations of how Daniel Farke wanted to play, I think.
I was at the Reading game, and the thing that boggled my mind was I wrote my team down, and I've seen Marco Stiepermann play once, and he played left back. Okay, and I'm like, is Stiepermann supposed to be there? And all of a sudden, one of the most fun things about Norwich this season, that was the first game where I know he'd been centre midfield, but he hadn't been number 10, and you kind of have this. I don't even know how to describe Stiepermann, but we're talking about balance in the last part, and all of a sudden, for the press, for the physicality, for the outball to the chest and the head, and he's actually a good passer. You had a real vital bit of glue in between a very clever right-sided forward and a very fast left-sided forward. And you wonder, could Stiepermann play in literally any other team in the Championship? Would he actually even look good? But just the perfect guy to drop in there, and I don't think that should be underplayed as you look for the rest of the season, that Norwich front 4 and this big... Okay, I don't know how to describe the guy, but...
I've never seen a footballer like
no.
him, and that's with all the will in the world, you know. And you spoke in the first part, Chris, about Norwich being adaptive to situations. That Stiepermann situation and him playing that position sort of underpins that, really, doesn't it?
And it goes back to what Ben was saying in the first part as well, about how the foundations of this were laid last season, because not only Stiepermann, but you've got Vrancic coming in and scoring a couple of winning goals, and you've got players who were now benefiting from having had a season of Championship football, of English football, really finding their rhythm. And Stiepermann, I think, and Vrancic are 2 players who, at the start of the season, there were rumours that Norwich may be looking to move them on, but they actually became key members of what was achieved this season. So, yeah, and this was the start of the season, the start of the run where it all began to fall into place properly for those players.
It did, yeah. Before that, though, Norwich suffered a 1-0 loss to Stoke. I mean, I don't know about you, Chris, but I don't think I've ever seen a game quite like that one, where Norwich had so much of the ball, so much of the game, and still lost it. It was almost like, at points, Stoke were just kicking the ball up the field. They didn't want to play with the ball.
It is not often that Norwich City, it's not often that any team gets applauded off at home after losing, and they did that day. And I think that showed you that the previous run we've just talked about, that's when fans really started to buy into what was happening, could really see proper progress, and were starting to identify and starting to love this set of players. And yeah, an unfortunate own goal from Tim Closer, who had been pretty decent up until that point. An unfortunate defeat, but the fact that the fans cheered them off afterwards, I think, was a little bit of a watershed in the season, because I think there were genuine concerns here at the club, in the corridors of power at the club, that the atmosphere at Carrow Road hadn't been great for a couple of years. So to see the team getting that sort of reception after a defeat, I think that meant a lot to everybody here, and it is another one of those little moments that you forget in the grand scheme of things.
And I suppose before that loss, we'd probably describe it as a fairly decent run of form for Norwich. So it was
4 wins, 1 draw, and then that's
exactly. So for Norwich to become contenders, it would always be about how they would respond to a defeat, and this sort of served as quite a good example of showing their credentials in a sense.
Well, you've gone from the narrative being, look, we're worried about this, where is this going, to, oh no, this is okay, we're winning games, and we know now Farke is now landing on all of the key components that are going to bring these winning streaks that we're going to talk about going forward.
I remember Todd Cantwell coming into the side as well during this spell. I think Onel Hernandez got injured, didn't he? And I remember commentating on the game at QPR. It's such a tight ground at Loftus Road. We're on the gantry, and you're so close to the pitch that you actually can't see the near touchline because you're overhanging it. You have to risk your life to look over and see the near touchline. And it meant we were right on top of the Norwich warm-up before the game. And Cedric Onsalan was with us, the former Norwich player, and he picked up on the fact that throughout the whole warm-up, Todd Cantwell was virtually being followed around by Jordan Rhodes. And Rhodes, the experienced member of the team, was talking him through the warm-up and what was about to happen. And when you get little glimpses like that, you realise how important this togetherness and the fact that the squad and those that are on the bench joining in, when you see little things like that, it makes you realise how important that all is. And Jordan Rhodes didn't get the amount of appearances, the amount of goals I thought he would, and he probably deserved this season, but this is why he's still seen as a valuable member of what was achieved, because of the way he looked after the younger players.
And that togetherness that would prove so pivotal, and you say little moments like that, I think is also what probably warmed fans to the idea of what was happening.
Definitely. I think when you had players coming out after games, even if they hadn't played, and joining in with the celebrations and saying in interviews how they wanted to be playing, but how they didn't mind not playing because they could understand why Daniel Farke was doing what he was doing, and that they appreciated the fact that players who were in a winning team were getting to keep their places, and it was so much easier for Daniel Farke, I think, to keep that winning team, because none of the players that were on the bench could argue with it, that the team was successful.
That's the theme for the rest of the season now. Winning team and winning players, even if they are much cheaper or much less experienced, he's gonna stick with them now, isn't he?
I mean, what does Jordan... I mean, we had a chat with the former Norwich player Mick Maguire, who is actually Jordan Rhodes' agent, and he was saying Jordan Rhodes is at a stage of his career where he doesn't want to be scoring 25, 30 goals a season for a team in a relegation battle. He wants to be part of a successful squad. And he really took to Norfolk, he took to the area, took to the fans, and the fans took to him really quickly. And I think he's been one of the success stories of the season, in terms of it didn't work out for him as much on the pitch as we thought it would, yet he's still been really taken into the bosom of Norwich City Football Club, and that says a lot for why they achieved what they did this season.
And there's 4 or 5 examples of that as well. We talk about Hanley and Closer as well, with the 2 centre-backs who are inexperienced in this division, quite young, and they've come out and said, well, when I played a certain opponent, Grant Hanley would say, this player plays like this, and that helped me to play against them. So that was a big part of it, wasn't it?
There's so many examples of it being, a real case of everybody in it together. All football people say that, all football clubs say it, but I haven't seen too many examples where you can actually see it for yourself, that you've got substitutes who are doing the pre-match warm-up, maybe with a separate fitness coach, and they're actually all enjoying themselves. They're all smiling and laughing, and they are enjoying being part of a squad. I mean, of course, they'd all rather be in a team. We accept that. But I think the work that Norwich City do in terms of the character of the players, the people they bring in, it's not just about their football skills and how good they are on the pitch. It's about the character and what they bring to the dressing room, and that's a factor that, as a commentator, as a fan, you never get to see. So it's difficult to judge, but it really has come to the fore this season.
And if we think of Norwich Cities of years gone by, those experienced players wouldn't have at one point put their arm around players because they'd have wanted to be in the team.
Yeah, and there were problems in Daniel Farke's first season. Daniel Farke's first game, Nelson Oliveira, I think actually is a very talented player, but when you see him coming off the bench, scoring a goal, and then rushing over to Daniel Farke and pointing at the number, that goes against everything that Norwich City have stood for this season. And you can see why, with certain personalities at the club, it hasn't worked out, and why when Norwich are looking for players this summer, they may have players they can afford who are supremely talented and would benefit the team on the pitch. But if they're not going to fit in the dressing room, if they're not going to handle being left out from time to time, they don't want them in the building. And I think you've seen this season why that is not a bad policy to have, certainly in the Championship.
In part 1, you said, you referenced the unbeaten run Norwich had in Farke's first year. After that Stoke game, they went 12 unbeaten, won 9 of those. Was this run more of a case of Norwich playing Daniel Farke's style of football as opposed to the first year, where it just felt like it was just
Madison
trying to,
free kick?
Yes, yeah, and it just felt like it was trying to get points in that sense.
Yeah, very, very, very much so. And like I alluded to, sometimes the work that you've done transpires later on, and just this narrative of keep finding stuff. And you're right, Chris, he did give Cantwell a good go. He gave him 5 or 6 games, but then against Villa in this run, Buendia is back and Cantwell comes in over Hernandez, and he's trying his best to fit Cantwell in, but that line of Buendia, Stiepermann and Hernandez was always gonna push to the front as we sort of come up to some of these very high scoring games.
Yeah, I was going to reference that. I think the first time that I really sat back and thought Norwich are quite good was in Swansea when they won 4-1.
Yeah.
I wasn't at Sheffield Wednesday when they won 4-0 obviously, but I think that was the time where I thought Norwich might have a good crack at the playoffs at that point.
Do you know what impressed me during this spell of the season was, and Ben's mentioned it there, that the win over Aston Villa, actually they didn't have Pukki for that game.
No, Rhodes
he got injured. Pukki got injured during the international break and missed, I think, 3 games. And Jordan Rhodes came in and did a decent job. You lost Hernandez, I think it was, injured for a few weeks. They'd lost Closer, they'd lost Hanley, and yet Players were coming in, and the standard of team performance and the system wasn't changing at all. And you saw how much belief Daniel Farke had in the system, how much the players had brought into it, and how everybody seemed to know what they were supposed to be doing. If Pukki's not playing, well, Rose will play and he'll do the same job. If Hernandez is out, Campbell will come in, and it all seemed to still work. They didn't lose too much from certain players dropping out of the team. But the Swansea and the Sheffield Wednesday games were significant, because one of the, not criticisms, but when we'd been talking to particularly former Norwich players on the radio about the good form they'd been on, one of the little question marks that kept coming up was they are doing well, but they're not really blowing teams away. That they're sneaking 1-0, 2-1. They're nothing against that, but they're not really blowing teams away. Those two games in particular, you started to really see what Norwich were about. And they had spells in matches of only sort of 15 or 20 minutes where they were just irresistible, relentless, attack after attack after attack. And they were scoring 2, 3, sometimes 4 goals in the space of 15, 20 minutes. And that's enough to win games in the Championship.
This is really the period where, as Chris mentions, we see high-scoring games, but we also see a lot of late winners as well. If we think Millwall, Bolton, Forest as well in this spell, where of course they came back from 3-0 down. For you, Ben, and you watch a lot of Championship football, is that a sign of fitness or is it a sign of their togetherness?
I've got, my head's literally exploding. I've got so much to say. First of all, I think what we started to see here, and this is what Norwich were brilliant at, is when Farke started, and we used to take the mick from down there, our possession stats, and all of a sudden they became this team that could be very patient, but then could be absolutely lethal at the same time with lateral passing. And I would sit and watch, and it's a 4-2-3-1, and all these players up here are trying to find space while the fullbacks are coming forward, and there's always 2 midfielders trying to feed in. And once they got that space and they broke that line, they were lethal. And finding Pukki. How many goals have we seen where you're in transition and literally 5 to 10 seconds later, Pukki's clear without taking a touch and sticks it in the net? So many times. So they all of a sudden they added this lethal lateral passing finishing streak to the patience that they had already. Now, I know you and I have discussed the late goals things before. Now, look, if you're looking at this from the outside and you're not at the games,
you say luck, don't you?
You say luck, you do. And I'm watching it, and I'm like, I remember I walked out of QPR and Norwich were 3-1 down, and then it went 3-2, and I'm like, they're going to score, they're going to equalise. You think it's luck, and I thought it was, oh God, they're having one of those seasons. And I thought that until I went to the Wigan game at the end of the season, which I know we'll talk about in the last thing. Yeah. And it was actually very calculated, because I don't know whether he did this against Millwall, but what I saw was around 10 minutes to go, it was a double or a triple substitution, 3 at the back, Aarons would play centre-back, little guy, a 4-man midfield with pretty much no holding player. Rhodes goes in the middle, so you've got a physical outlet. Pukki moves just to the left, as if he's hard enough to track from the middle. He's just going to move out there. Hernandez went one side, and it was basically 7 guys attacking. And I kind of sat at that Wigan game, and it's quite something to watch. It was like, Jesus, this is a title. I can see how they conceded goals, but it wasn't. And Alex Ferguson used to say this. He'd say, right, here's the tactics, unless we're losing in the last 10 minutes, in which case, take risk, gamble, take risk. And you'll be able to, you were at these games, but I don't know whether it was, I remember hearing him talk about a 3 at the back solution, and it was just 7 guys forward. So I have to admit, I was wrong about that, thinking that, these are lucky late goals, particularly the Forest game. I just had a look. He created 6 big chances in the Forest game. They should have won that game, shouldn't they?
Yes. Had they had 5 minutes, I think a lot of people would have said they would have.
There you go. So that was my view on it. And it really, what I saw against Wigan, I don't know if it was the same against Millwall or Bolton, the comeback games, it was gripping to watch. You know, you've got McLean playing wing-back, Stiepermann playing wing-back, and Vrancic and Leitner are the centre midfielders, and Aarons is playing centre-half.
Yeah. I think the difference between Norwich City and a lot of teams, that when you see this in the past, and I think most teams sneak a last-minute winner at some point during a season, quite often it's because you've put a defender on up front and you try to get a knockdown. The fact that Norwich got, particularly the Millwall game, they got this dramatic comeback, 2 goals in stoppage time, without actually lumping it. They still
Overloads.
kept the ball down.
It was
and they were still they were playing a more exaggerated version of what they'd been trying to do all game.
Really well put. It's an exaggerated version of what they were already doing.
I was going to ask you about that, Chris. The fact that it probably shows the extent of Farke's beliefs, because actually in those moments he didn't opt to put centre-backs forward sort of without
You're playing against Jake Cooper. There's no
of course,
point anyway.
Exactly.
He kept with his style, didn't he?
And
searching for winners and searching for equalisers in the last minute of games.
Yeah, and there's one game this season when he didn't do that, and it was right towards the end of the season, the Sheffield Wednesday game, when Vrancic got that free kick. But when it looked as if Norwich were going to lose the game, he suddenly brought Tim Closer on and put him up front.
Yes.
And I remember thinking, that's the only time I thought maybe the jitters or the size of what they're about to achieve is starting to sort of get to them a bit, because he did something in that game that he didn't do any other time the whole season. He'd been very consistent and very proud, I think, of the fact that, they'd got these late goals, but not without compromising his principles. And he'd made it seem like a plan that he'd been working on, and that, they would keep the ball early in the game, tire the opposition out, and become more dangerous as the game goes on. So when he put Tim Closer up front against Sheffield Wednesday in April, I thought, hang on, what's going on here? But you get one late goal during a season, fine. You get a couple, then maybe a bit of luck. But when it's happening again and again,
there is context behind
then
it.
you've just got to say, well, this isn't an accident.
But you have to understand from the outside how it looks to everybody else. It was
what
is going on here?
It's no different to what we said whenever Leeds got their late winners.
There you go.
Oh, lucky on Leeds. And you do when it's not your team.
Yeah, fair.
I want to ask sort of both of you a question now, sort of based on what you said earlier, and it comes back to that point about Maddison, where last season Norwich were scoring a lot of sort of long range, or Maddison was scoring a lot of long range efforts.
We call them low percentage chance goals,
And yet this season we've seen a lot more goals where actually Pukki's had quite a few tap-ins. Does that show sort of the development of Daniel Farke's style of play, the fact that Norwich have reverted away from sort of relying upon one player to score absolute worldies every game for points, to now it being sort of intellectual football that works through the lines and works through the thirds actually to try and get a tap in or a moment of in the box where someone can get a shot away, because that seemed to be the big difference in terms of the attacking output.
Well, Man City score a lot of tap-ins. That's the modern football thing, is pass. And football's actually quite simple when you boil it down. A good team creates lots of big chances and doesn't concede many big chances. And that is viable, because if you consistently do that, you'll probably be somewhere near the top of your league. I don't mind how they do that. Cardiff under Neil Warnock is a good team. They create lots of big chances. Okay, they do it from long throws, and they don't concede many big chances. So intellectual football, I'm not totally, winning is winning, and if you create a lot of big chances. But am I right that it comes up on who scored? Teemu Pukki, most goals in the box, 28.
Yes.
So all his goals must have been
I think he scored one header this year.
Only one header the whole season.
Yeah, amazing. And this is the season of pattern of play, isn't it? Because a lot of what you've said today, you could say the same for Sheffield United. They brought players in and out, overloading centre-backs, but all of the centre-backs on the books could do it. And there's nothing wrong with scoring tap-ins. You're a damn good team if you consistently create.
It was about unlocking defences then,
exactly.
Isn't it?
And it's about pattern of play. It's about, here goes Aaron's up here, Buendia cuts in here, Pukki's over here, you've overloaded 3-on-2, your players are good enough to pass the ball through, and the striker never misses. So I think you should be very proud of those tap-ins.
I think, and when I've heard Daniel Farke talk about this, he doesn't really buy into the fact that the two seasons have been radically different. He would say the first season, we did create some great chances, we just didn't take them. And I think I'm not sure where the stats he's quoting, but he would say that in his first season, actually Norwich were among the top teams in the division for chances created. The big difference this season was that they had Pukki up there who could absolutely take them. And they hadn't had that the year before. And maybe that leads into the fact that the rest of the team is confident that you've got a striker up there who will stick the ball in the back of the net. So maybe, with hindsight, we're saying this. Maybe the seeds were there in the first season again, but they won't take.
Chris, look at all the threat though. You've got Hernandez who can dribble through. You've got Buendia who can play Pukki in. You've got Stiepermann who, if you back off, has got a good long distance shot. And you've got Pukki who, and we haven't said this yet, Stiepermann and Pukki are very good defenders. Very, very good. They're the ones that press. Hernandez isn't going to give you a lot defensively. Buendia will probably get himself sent off if he gives you a lot defensively. But Pukki and Stiepermann's pressing was
they work. That's the
excellent.
Thing.
Really good. Like Ian Rush used to do for Liverpool. He would be your frontline defender, you know.
It's no surprise when Buendia eventually got sent off this season. I think we could see that was a ticking time bomb.
I think he had the most tackles for Norwich.
The amount of times he won the ball in the final 25 yards of the pitch, and with the amount of times Pukki would suddenly appear at right back and win a challenge. Again, that's one of the things that is perhaps underrated, just the effort, the work rate these players put in this season.
And finally, for this part, this was the period that Norwich first topped the league
When
league
did that
table.
happen?
I believe it would have been, well, they were top at Swansea, weren't they? So it probably would have been the Millwall game. I think they went top. I might be correcting on that. But in terms of a Norwich supporter, Chris, that felt quite unbelievable, didn't it, from where we were in the summer and even at the start of this season?
It really did. I think you went from, at the start of the season, your very most optimistic moments were, we might sneak in the top 6. If we have a good end to the season, these lads all get used to each other, we might sneak into the top 6. To suddenly, the playoffs at least became a realistic proposition. I'm not saying I was still saying we're definitely going up automatically, we're definitely going to win the league, but I suddenly felt, do you know what, at the very least, they're going to keep this promotion race, this attempt to finish in the top 6. This is now going to see us through the rest of the season. This isn't going to be a mid-table season. And
as someone who watches a lot of the EFL, a lot of the Championship, were you as surprised to see Norwich at the top as everyone was inside the club?
The realisation gradually dawned on us, and we're going to talk about Elland Road later. The realisation gradually dawns, and you're just thinking the whole time, they're on a good run, they're getting a few lucky goals. Oh, Pukki's on fire, he'll get injured or what have you. Yeah, we can pinpoint the exact game where the whole world went, hang on a minute, this is not a playoff team. They're going to get automatic promotion. And no, I thought, they'll drop down. And I remember looking at the fixtures as well, the really hard run over Christmas, which we're going to come on to, but just so surprised.
I think that just about rounds it up for part 2 of the review. Thanks to Chris and Ben again. If you enjoyed that, like, subscribe, comment, all that jazz. And we'll see you in part 3, where we're going to be talking about that run over Christmas that Ben's just alluded to, with the very difficult fixtures and the sort of mini injury crisis that Norwich had at the time. So stay tuned for that.